Radio check, anybody copy? Paglarivsi. This is episode 7, Conversations with an Inuit Philosopher on Coffee and Quaq. Coffee and Quaq is a podcast I created to celebrate and explore contemporary native life in urban Alaska. This episode, I sit down with Warren Maaruk Jones, a self-proclaimed Inuit philosopher, among many other things. He's been a commercial fisherman, pitch salesman, Marine Corps infantryman. He served in Operation Iraqi Freedom, and after leaving the military, studied political science and philosophy. He's an Alaska Salmon Fellow with the Humanities Forum and the former Governance Fellow at First Alaskans Institute. Warren is a steward of Northern Philosophy, the idea that the North has its own unique epistemology, ethics, and more. He's an award-winning journalist and published poet.
There's all these little parts of our culture that speak to how different we are and how different that we view the world. I think it's really important for us to articulate what those are for two reasons. One, for us, which even though I think that we already know it, right? But the other part of it is so that we can articulate it to other people, right? You've got a whole nation full of people that think that they don't have a culture.
My conversation with Warren starts with the definition of culture. And culture is one of those things that you talk about a lot, but it can be hard to articulate into words.
Okay, so the definition of culture. The arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively.
Yeah, and that's a good one. You know, I think that all of the definition of culture that are provided touch on some aspect of it. Feels like that definition certainly leans more towards when you refer to somebody as cultured, what does that mean? You know, somebody who's cultured has a lot of knowledge about the arts and about literature and about sciences and things like that, right? And so somebody who's cultured has this a broad scheme of information that they're operating from. Or you're the one that defines the culture.
Right.
Right? You know, and then some people do. You see them. These are the trendsetters and things like that, right? Like people that define the culture for everybody else. You know, right? What does it mean to be a cultured person in the Alaska Native context, right? Well, I think that we know, right? It's probably something that we both share, feeling inadequate in this respect, because we're what is it, if we were cultured, right, we'd probably be ice fishing or some shit, you know,
Yeah. We all have an understanding of it, but what is the actual definition? And that would be really cool if we could, define it someday. Is that possible?
Well, yeah, and I think that everybody does have a good idea of exactly, they know what they're talking about, but a lot, and this is, I think, true for everybody. Sometimes it's really hard to articulate something that you know. You know what you're talking about, but I don't know how to explain this to you.
Yeah.
You know, and this is I think one of the challenges with culture is that there's this thing that we're talking about, and that everybody kind of has an idea of what it is, except for people that think that they don't have a culture, in which case, you know, a culture is something that other people have, right? You know, and
driving, right? So you know how to drive, but if you have to define every single little movement about it, then you get a little confused. You're I don't know. They're how do you know that you're too far to the right? I'm I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just we are.
Yeah. You
turn a little.
You just get the feeling for it, right? You know.
Yeah.
And so, but you could, if you sat down and thought about it long enough, just articulate, okay, well, this is what driving's about. Yeah. You know, this is you know, and you could explain it. But even then, it might be kind of hard to explain, because, what you're talking about, how to know when you're in the center of the road, I remember that being, one of the hardest things, because it doesn't feel like you're in the center of the road, right? Yeah. But then you get used to it, and then you see it, and then, it's whoever's teaching you to drive is nope, this is just what it feels like. If you were to look at your car from the outside, you're in your lane, you know, it just, So, I do think that's actually a good example of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the first definition. Second one is the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. And then they go in and say religion, social, ethnic, and educational norms.
Again, that's a decent definition, but I think that what it suffers from is the problem that all the definitions suffer from, which is that they're too vague. You know, like it ends up being like this meaningless catch-all of like, okay, culture is all these things. My problem with it was, from my perspective, is that I didn't know what it meant for me, right? And it just came up in conversations, right? So the guy that I'm going to be working with on my podcast, I think I mentioned this to you, he's a guy from Florida, right? He's a white guy, real cool guy, right? We met through actually online gaming. Both of us were Marines, and we just hit it off and had conversations about all kinds of stuff, right? And one of the conversations that we had actually was about culture itself. Now, he doesn't remember this, but it's okay because I have a much better memory. But we were having a conversation about where I was just telling him about some cultural activity that we were doing, and he was like, you know, I really admire the fact that you have a culture. You know, he said, I wish I had one. You know, and I was like, yeah, dog, you got a culture. You know, and he was like, nah, man, I'm just a white guy. If I have a culture, well, then what is it? You know? And I was super annoyed because I didn't have a good answer for him. You know, and the truth is that I didn't even have a good answer for myself, right? Because if he had like asked me like, what is your culture? You know, I would have given the same, like, well, my culture is like this thing, but not this thing. It's also this thing, you know, like this. It's really hard to explain, you know. And then like, there's also this kind of like really deep spiritual aspect to it that I don't think can be explained. You know, like how do I tell you how much this means to me and why is it meaningful to me? You know? Yeah.
And I think that we feel that a lot too. You know, just like even like if you hear a song, like a native song or something. At least for me, even when I'm away. Like when I was going to school down south. And I can relate with that because I remember I was doing this like blog post for my regional corporation for my experiences at an internship at NASA that I was doing down there. And I said something about like, I'm here, you know, sharing my culture with all of these other people and learning about theirs too. I knew that it was, if I have one, they have to have one. Everyone has one. And I remember thinking that.
And so, but again, it begs the question, right? Like, well, then what is it, right? You know, and this was this question to me, and that's like I said, I was so annoyed that I didn't have an answer, right? Because now I'm just like sitting there like, well, I don't know what the fuck it is, but you got one, you know, but it was.
But what was his definition then? He's like, I'm so glad you're.
Well, because, well, again, like, I mean, I don't think that he really thought it through, too. I mean, this is a word that's used very commonly, you know, and it's used in all the aspects, right? Like, think about it, like gun culture, rape culture, consumer culture, native culture. It's the same thing, right? Like, we're just cultures, right? Well, so I don't think that he really thought about it. And, of course, I didn't either, you know, and this is just like my challenging him forced me to like challenge myself to come up with an answer. Right. Yeah. You know, it's like, all right, well, I'm not going to let this go.
I'm going to figure it out.
Like, I don't care if it takes me the rest of my life. I'm going to figure this out. And it did come out, you know, through a lot of conversation. And actually, so at the time I was reading this book that was called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, right? Written by this guy named Kuhn. I think it was first published in like the 60s or something like that. But so in it, this is where the term paradigm comes from, right? Paradigms and paradigm shifts. Kuhn coined that term, right? Okay. And so, without getting into it too much, right, I took Kuhn's concept of paradigm and retooled it, right? And so Kuhn's concept of paradigm is basically, it's like the scheme of information that scientists operate from, you know, so like a chemist, you know, there's sets of assumptions, there's a scheme of information, there's the periodic table, like there's tools that they use that are part of their trade, right? And that's their paradigm. Right? And it's the best that you know. How could you operate without a scheme of information? You know what I mean? Like this is arguably it's one of the most important parts about you, right? Like this is the part of you that gets formed from the child. Like you have a son. How long have you known him?
Since he was so 3
right?
years.
But think about his development, right? Like you watch his scheme of information, it changes, right? And it's based on the things that he learns from observing and the things that you teach him, right? And as his scheme of information gets bigger and bigger, you know, like it makes him able to deal with more complexity, right? Because there's questions that you don't have to ask anymore. There's things that you don't have to think about. Like it simplifies things, right? Because it's like a lot of things that are part of a culture are things that your ancestors learned and lessons that they learned that you don't have to learn again, right? Because learning those lessons takes a long time. You know, and learning shit the hard way, I mean, there's a reason why they call it the hard way, you know, because there's the easy way, which would be just to listen to the shit that your parents told you in the first place.
Or die.
Yeah, right, you know? Yeah. Right? So this scheme of information is what he's talking about. Like, that's what a paradigm is, right? So recognizing that I probably did just a garbage job of explaining it, if you really want to know, just read the book. It's actually really good. But the point is that I took his concept of paradigm and retooled it and used it as the definition of culture, which says that what a culture is, it's the scheme of information that an individual or a group of individuals operate from, right? Mm-hmm. And so the scheme of information includes things like there's a narrative, there's a set of assumptions, there's values. It's literally just an information scheme that dictates and tells you how to act in any given situation. And there's other constituents part of it too, right? So there's the culture itself, and then there's traditions, and then there's heritage, right? And I'm sure there's more to it than that, but like this is where I'm at right now, and it feels good in making these three distinctions, right? So the heritage distinction, I think, is a fun one to talk about, mostly just because it's kind of like a hot button issue, right? and this actually relates to me too, right? So I am actually Gwich'in and Yupik by heritage, by blood. Mm-hmm. My dad's Gwich'in. My family on that side comes from Fort Yukon and Nenana. And on my mom's side, we're Yupik, from the Hooper Bay, Scammon Bay area, right? But my stepdad's Inupiaq. Right, and I never met my biological father or met any of the people on that side of the family, but I knew I was raised with my stepdad, and so I was raised around Inupiaq people, mm-hmm. right? And so I always felt really uncomfortable. Well, number one, I didn't even know I was Athabascan for many, many years until I met some of the people that knew who my family were and confirmed that where my family came from, right?
Yeah.
And B, because I grew up like Yupik and Inupiaq, I was very much more like that, right? Like I like my seal oil from Shishmaref, right? Very, very specific. I'll eat it from other places, but like I prefer it kind of Inupiaq style. My food, because this is the framework I was raised up in, right? And so even though my heritage is Gwich'in, my culture is not. My culture is just like, as I mentioned before, some weird neo-Eskimo culture, right? Where it's like I'm like this kind of like white native hybrid person. Mm-hmm. Like I think in English, but the concepts that I think in are not stuff that normal white folks listen or think about, I had a Native American woman down in the States who was 164th Lakota, and if you're listening, I'm sorry if you ever happen to hear this, but like she treated me like I was like this fucking like surprised bloodline because I looked native, right? And when I was younger, I was like living in Minnesota. I used to have really long hair, right? Okay. Like past the middle of my back long, and so I was like living in Minnesota, I was working landscaping for this place called the Lawn Ranger, and so I was working outside this office building without a shirt on at 19 with my long flowing black hair, and this 164th Lakota chick who was like, I didn't even like when she told me she was Native American, I'm looking at her like, who? What were you? Because I'm 19 years old, Yeah. And it was so funny because I just remember like we had these arguments, where I'm sitting there going like, but you're not Native, and she's like, but I am, and it was like because she cared about all this stuff, and she was telling me about the genocide that happened, and of course I seriously had no idea what she's talking about. When I was 19, I was like worried about getting in her pants and getting the six-pack, like I didn't care about the things that she was talking about, but she was super into me because I was Native. That to me seemed like an almost weird borderline kind of idolatry weird thing, and there's something to be said for genetics. I do think that genetics are important, right? Mm-hmm. So the thought experiment that I use to demonstrate what I'm talking about with heritage, right? Like I just use myself there, but like the one that I use in the paper was like you take a Yupik baby, right, and a French baby, and you switch them at birth, right? 30 years later, we go and visit this Yupik baby, right? A little girl, or it was a little girl, and now she's a 30-year-old woman, right? And she was born and raised in France, speaking the French language. She thinks in French, she knows French history, she eats French food, right? Would you say that baby was Yupik, or would you say that baby was French?
Probably French.
Yeah, culturally, she's French. Her heritage is Yupik, though, right? And that's real, and you can't actually take that away from her, and there's real, I don't want to say consequences because that seems like a negative word, but there's like your genetics play an important role for a lot of things in your life and things that we don't even know at this point, mm-hmm. right? So like I don't think heritage can be poo-pooed, And I don't think that we should, right? Because it's like, you take that person, what if at 30 she moves back